I turned 70 on a muggy August evening, the kind of evening when the ocean air clung to the skin and made every fabric feel heavy. Clara had insisted I come down to the Outer Banks, saying she had planned something special at her house by the dunes. She was careful with her words on the phone, as if dangling a rare prize in front of me. I accepted because saying no would have seemed petty, though my gut told me I was stepping into a familiar trap. When I arrived, the driveway was already crowded with cars. I recognized license plates from cousins upstate, my sister's grandchildren, even my late husband's brother. The sight should have warmed me, but instead, a chill settled in. Clara never invited me to gatherings so fully, not unless there was some performance in mind. The door swung open before I could knock. Clara stood there in a gauzy summer dress, hair blown out to perfection, smile stretched thin like ribbon. Surprise, Mom. 70 deserves a crowd. She kissed my cheek quickly already, turning back toward the chatter of the living room. I stepped inside, clutching the small bouquet Elias and Nora had picked from my garden that morning. The main room was buzzing with voices. A long table stretched across the space, draped in white linen polished glasses catching the light. Every seat was taken at least a dozen family members already in place, raising glasses, calling out greetings. For a moment, I thought Clara had planned a toast, and my heart softened. Then I noticed no chair left empty. Clara guided me toward the kitchen with a light hand at my elbow. "We made room for you right here," she said brightly, unfolding a metal chair by the counter. A paper plate sat on the surface beside it. I blinked. Someone chuckled awkwardly, and I heard my cousin whisper, "The guest of honor." But Clara only clapped her hands. "Mom's fine here, the main table's already full." She said it with the same casual tone she used when telling her children where to drop their sandy flip-flops. I lowered myself onto the folding chair slowly, as if any sudden movement might split the air further. The bouquet slid from my hands onto the counter. Laughter and silverware clinking rose from the dining room while I stared at the patterned linoleum beneath my feet. An aunt tried to bring me a glass of wine. Clara intercepted her. "Oh, she doesn't drink much these days." Her voice was smooth, decisive, as though I couldn't speak for myself. From my post at the kitchen doorway, I could see the length of the table. Clara sat at the head mic at her side, their 4 children scattered like bright ornaments down the row. My chair sat apart, half hidden behind a doorway. I thought of all the summers I'd been told there wasn't room at the cottage, and now, on my own birthday, the story was staged in plain sight. I tried to swallow food, but everything tasted of cardboard. A nephew leaned back in his chair to ask me about my garden. Clara cut in, "Mom still fiddles with her tomatoes, don't you, Mom?" Her words were sugar-dipped but left a bitter aftertaste. The cake came later, candles wobbling as they were carried past me. Everyone sang. I mouthed along, though no one noticed from the kitchen. When Clara leaned over to slice the first piece, she handed it to Mike, not me. By the time a small plate was passed my way, the candles were smoke. I looked around at the faces, some genuinely warm, some averted. I saw sympathy in my sister's eyes, discomfort in my cousin's, but none of them spoke. And why would they? Clara had been setting the stage for years, making me an accessory at her gatherings, instead of the root they had grown from. I smiled through the evening, but the smile cracked at the edges. Each remark, each dismissive gesture, pressed like a thumbprint into wet cement, setting hard. By the time I stepped outside to leave, the night air felt clearer than it had in months. The roar of the Atlantic in the distance seemed to echo my own pulse, steady rising, unwilling to be drowned. Driving away, I realized the folding chair in that kitchen wasn't just a careless slight. It was the symbol of 10 years of quiet erasure. And as the headlights stretched across the highway, I knew something in me had shifted for good. Driving home from Clara's house that night, the road stretched before me like a ribbon of lost time. The headlights traced 10 years of summers I had never shared, each one marked by the same hollow phone call, the same practiced excuse. It always came in March, when the magnolias were beginning to bloom. Clara would call with a tone rehearsed to sound apologetic, though underneath it rang with finality. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but there's just not enough room at the beach house this year. The kids need their space, and with Mike's parents stopping by, well, you understand." I always said, yes, I understood. I swallowed the words that burned in my throat and let her off the hook. Year after year. The summers blurred together after that. Photos on social media of Clara's children. Dorian with his kite high above the dunes. Helena perched on her father's shoulders. Little twins, Ruby and Seth, buried in sand up to their necks. Their cheeks were sun-kissed, their smiles wide, their lives threaded with the luxury of belonging. Meanwhile, my own grandchildren, Elias and Nora, watched from the sidelines. They were children of my late son, raised by me after the accident left them without parents. Every June they would ask the same question. "Grandma, why don't we ever go to Aunt Clara's beach house?" Elias would say, his voice hopeful at first, then heavier as the years went by. Nora's eyes, softer but sharper, would search my face as though she could see the answer I wouldn't give. "Is it because we're not wanted there?" I would busy myself with dishes or point out the garden needing water. "It's just crowded, sweetheart. Maybe another year." Each time the words felt like stones in my mouth, weighing heavier the older they grew. We filled our summers as best we could. Trips to the local pool, picnics by the river, long afternoons at the library where the air conditioning hummed steadily. I told them stories of their father's childhood, how he too had played in the surf, how the sea had once been our family's backdrop. But they noticed the difference. They saw the pictures, heard the laughter spilling through Clara's posts, and knew something was missing. I carried my silence like a shield, convincing myself I was protecting them. In truth, the silence protected Clara, not them. It allowed her to pretend she had done no real harm, that her excuses were reasonable. Each maybe next year was a stone laid into a wall that separated us, and I stood on the outside building it higher by saying nothing. There were moments I nearly broke. The summer Elias turned 12, he came home from school and said, "Grandma, Dorian told me they're going to the cottage again." He asked why I never come. I didn't know what to say. His voice cracked on the last word, and for a heartbeat, I nearly told him the truth that his aunt had deemed us expendable. But I bit down hard on my tongue. By the time Nora was old enough to notice patterns, she didn't even ask. She would just look at the photos online, then close the screen with a quiet determination, as though training herself not to want. That was the part that hurt most, not my exclusion, but watching the desire fade from her face. 10 summers gone, replaced with quiet substitutions, hollow reassurances, and the weight of absence. And through it all, I kept my silence, afraid that naming the truth would break something that couldn't be mended. But sitting in my car after the birthday dinner, the salt air still clinging to my skin, I understood what had already broken. Silence had not saved us. It had carved the distance deeper. And for the first time in 10 years, I wondered what would happen if I stopped swallowing the words and let them out. The morning after the birthday dinner, the taste in my mouth was bitter, as though the smoke from those extinguished candles had settled on my tongue and refused to leave. I tried to wash it away with coffee, but every swallow reminded me of the folding chair, the paper plate, and the laughter that had carried on without me. The phone rang twice that day. Once it was my sister, murmuring that she was sorry for how things had gone, though her words were vague, careful meant to soothe without offending Clara. The second was my cousin Lila, who spoke in hushed tones. It wasn't right, Marjorie. We all saw it. Yet neither of them had spoken up in the moment. Their silence echoed mine from years past, a silence that seemed to keep Clara safely seated at the head of the table while I faded into the background. By evening, I drove back to the beach house, telling myself I'd forgotten my shawl. What I wanted, perhaps, was to see if Clara felt any sting of regret. The house was quieter than the night before, just a handful of relatives still lingering, helping themselves to leftovers. I stepped inside without knocking. Old habits die hard when it comes to your own child's door. From the hallway, I heard Clara's voice before I saw her. She was standing with Lila wineglass in hand, her tone dripping with amusement. Honestly, she should be grateful we even host her. At her age, what more does she expect? We make space when we can. That folding chair was fine. Lila chuckled weakly, a sound more of discomfort than agreement, but she didn't challenge her. I froze. My shawl was still in the car, I realized, but I couldn't move, not yet. I listened as my daughter reduced me to a burden, a guest tolerated, rather than a mother honored. It wasn't the first time she'd spoken that way through the years. I'd caught pieces of it disguised in jokes, wrapped in condescension. But that night, it landed like ash on my skin, impossible to brush away. I left before anyone noticed me, the sound of my own footsteps swallowed by the surf outside. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel and stared out at the dark horizon. For 70 years, I had accommodated and softened myself to keep peace. Clara had grown accustomed to that, to my gratitude for every crumb, for every half-invitation disguised as kindness. But as the waves pounded the shore in steady rhythm, I knew something had shifted. Gratitude had become a cage, and I was the one who had locked the door. I whispered the vow aloud so the night air could hear it, as witness no more gratitude for humiliation. The words were simple, but they carried weight, like stones I'd been shouldering suddenly dropped to the ground. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the anger I had swallowed for a decade, to let it burn in my chest rather than dissolve into excuses. When I finally started the engine, I didn't feel lighter exactly, but I felt clearer. Clara's words had stripped away any remaining illusion that silence could mend what was broken. Something else would have to take its place. Something built on my own terms. The road home stretched ahead, lined with shadows of pines bending in the wind. And as I drove, the memory of another road came to me, the one that led north to Vermont, where once upon a time, I had built a life that was mine alone. The night after overhearing Clara, I lay awake listening to the creaks of my small house. Sleep would not come. Instead, my mind wandered back to another place, another time when I was not merely tolerated, but relied upon. It was more than 40 years ago in Vermont beside a lake, so still it mirrored the pines without a ripple. My husband Daniel had inherited a shabby lodge from his uncle, a place with sagging porches and wood smoke, forever clinging to the rafters. We were newly married then, young enough to think work was simply another kind of adventure. Daniel handled the repairs with calloused hands, but the lodge would not have survived without what I brought to it. I kept the book's every column of figures precise. I managed the schedules of the part-time cleaners and the high school boys who hauled firewood. I answered calls on a rotary phone that rang at all hours, greeting strangers with a warmth that convinced them to choose us over more polished resorts. I remember the rhythm of those days, rising before dawn to prepare ledgers, greeting fishermen who wanted coffee at 5, then checking in families by noon. I was quick with numbers, sharper than people assumed, and I loved the dance of balancing costs with reservations. Daniel often joked that I was the real backbone of the place. Without you, Marjorie, the roof would fall in, and we'd never notice until the rain poured down. Those were years of exhaustion, yes, but also of purpose. The sound of children splashing at the dock, the scent of pine smoke curling from the chimneys in autumn, the steady ring of the cash register. When weekends filled with guests, it all built a sense of worth that no folding chair could ever erase. When Daniel died, I sold the lodge. I told myself it was too much to manage alone, too much weight for one pair of shoulders. But the truth is, I doubted myself. I believed what others implied, that my usefulness ended with his. I let that belief shrink me, and over time, Clara filled the space I had abandoned, her voice louder, her authority unquestioned. Now, lying in the dark, I thought of those years again, with a clarity that startled me. I hadn't simply helped at the lodge. I had run it. Every decision that kept the doors open had passed through my hands. The knowledge was still there, quiet but alive, waiting for me to acknowledge it. What if Clara was wrong? What if I was not a burden, but a woman who once built something and could build again? The thought sat in me like a coal faintly glowing, daring me to breathe life into it. Images of the Vermont lodge came rushing back, the worn guest books, the smell of fresh sheets dried in mountain air, the laughter of families who returned year after year. My chest ached with longing, but also with recognition. I had not lost that part of myself. It had been buried under years of silence, beneath Clara's pronouncements, under the weight of humiliation disguised as hospitality. I closed my eyes and pictured not the lake in Vermont, but the ocean waves I had heard outside Clara's beach house. Salt instead of pine. Sand instead of forest. The thought shifted, reshaped itself. Why not the coast? Why not me? The bitterness of the birthday evening still lingered, but now it carried something new, something sharper than grief resolve. I did not have to wait for space at Clara's table. I had once owned a table of my own, filled with guests who paid to sit at it. Perhaps it was time to build one again. The first step would be to look quietly, without telling anyone. I would need numbers. Possibilities, something concrete to hold on to. The sharpness I thought had dulled was still there, just waiting to be tested, and as I drifted into restless sleep, one decision settled firmly in my chest. I would not let Clara's words define the rest of my life. The morning light came in pale strips through my curtains, and instead of reaching for the kettle, I reached for the worn ledger I kept tucked in the drawer of my desk. Years of numbers scratched out in my own handwriting sat waiting for me. For a long while, I just stared at the pages as though they were a foreign language I had forgotten. But the longer I looked, the more familiar it became, like a song I hadn't sung in years, but could still recall when the melody returned. I began with the obvious, my monthly pension, modest but steady. Then the savings account I'd guarded like a fragile flame after Daniel passed, rarely touching it except for emergencies. I flipped to the page where I'd written down the proceeds from selling the farmland 2 summers ago. The one I'd told Clara was too much work to maintain. What I hadn't told her was how carefully I had invested most of that money, letting it sit and grow quietly while I lived simply. Adding the numbers, I surprised myself. There was more than I expected, enough to do something real if I was careful. Enough to make Clara's folding chair look like the flimsy piece of metal it was. Still, money was one thing. Possibility was another. I needed guidance, someone who wouldn't laugh at the idea of a 70-year-old woman searching for opportunity. That's when I thought of Victor Hanley. Victor was the son of a woman I used to teach Sunday school with. I remembered him as a boy with skinned knees and a shy smile. But he had grown into a property broker with a reputation for being honest in a trade where honesty was scarce. I found his number rehearsed, what I would say, then dialed before I could lose courage. Mrs. Alden? His voice was warm, surprised. It's been years. What can I do for you? I told him the truth, or at least most of it, that I was considering investing in property. Something small, maybe a place I could manage with help. I left out Clara. Left out the birthday chair. Left out the ache that had pushed me to this point. He didn't hesitate. I've actually got a listing that might interest you. It's rough, but the bones are good. Not far from the Carolina coast. A few days later, we met at his office. The walls were lined with photos of houses, smiling families, holding keys, beach cottages with porches facing the sea. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. The first picture nearly broke my heart. A once proud resort, 2 stories tall, its paint flaking like sunburned skin, its windows boarded in places. Weeds crawled through the parking lot, and the sign out front leaned to one side as if exhausted by years of neglect. It was called Seabourn Haven. Victor explained. 12 rooms, a dining hall, prime beachfront. The owners ran out of money and let it fall apart. They're desperate to sell now. I ran my finger along the faded image. To anyone else, it might have looked like a ruin, a grave marker of someone else's failed dream. But I saw something else. I saw Daniel's lodge by the lake, how we had scrubbed and mended until it shone again. I saw the dining hall filled with voices, the rooms welcoming strangers who became regulars. How much, I asked. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly against the folder. Victor told me the price, and I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. It was a risk, yes, but one I might be able to afford if I moved carefully. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. It's a lot of work, Mrs. Alden. Some people would call it too much work. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. Work doesn't scare me, Victor. Being invisible does. His expression softened, and for the first time in years, I felt someone taking me seriously. I left his office with the papers tucked under my arm, the scent of salt air already rising in my imagination. Victor drove me out to see Seabourn Haven on a gray morning, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to match the weight in my chest. The property sat at the edge of a small town where the dunes met the water, and though the paint peeled and the shutters sagged, the ocean stretched beyond it in a wide sweep of silver. Even in disrepair, the view was breathtaking. We stepped onto the cracked walkway leading up to the lobby. Grass sprouted between the stones, tall and untended. The front doors groaned when Victor pushed them open. Inside, dust lay thick on the counters, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, but sunlight streamed through the high windows, striking across the worn wooden floor. I could almost hear footsteps again, suitcases rolling, children laughing. The owners were already waiting for us, an older couple, shoulders bent, faces weary from years of struggle. They had tried to keep the place alive, Victor told me, but medical bills and the weight of debt had drained them. As we shook hands, I saw the shame in their eyes, the way people look when they are giving up something they once loved. We walked through the rooms together, 12 in total, each one tired, but still holding a trace of charm. Wicker furniture, sagged curtains, faded to pale threads, but the bones were there. Balconies facing the sea, a dining hall large enough to seat 30, a kitchen that could be revived with polish and new steel. Outside, the gardens were a tangle of weeds, but I could see the outline of paths, the ghost of flower beds. I imagined children running barefoot through them, imagined planting roses along the trellis, the way Daniel and I once did at the Vermont Lodge. When we finished the tour, the owners led us back to the lobby. The woman clasped her hands and said almost in a whisper, "We just want someone to care for it again." Victor looked at me. They're asking for far less than market value. They can't afford to hold on. I studied the scuffed counter, the place where keys must have once hung, each tagged with a room number. In that moment, I saw not ruin, but possibility. I saw a chance to take back what had been taken from me, not just the summers, not just the table at family gatherings, but the sense of belonging, of purpose. I nodded, slowly. I'll buy it. The owner's relief was visible, like a weight falling from their shoulders. Papers were drawn up within days. The price was indeed a fraction of what the land alone was worth, but still, it was the largest purchase I had ever made on my own. As I signed my name, my hand trembled, not from doubt, but from the enormity of the step. Victor congratulated me, his tone professional, but warm. "You've done something bold, Mrs. Alden." "I've done something necessary," I replied. Driving home, I thought of Clara. I thought of her smug voice, her careless dismissal. She should be grateful we even host her. The image of that folding chair rose in my mind, and I nearly laughed aloud. She had no idea that while she was busy tightening her grip on a table that excluded me, I had bought a table of my own 12 rooms and a dining hall to prove it. I told no one, not Elias, not Nora, not even my sister. Secrets, I realized, had a power of their own. This was mine to keep until the time was right, until the foundations were solid and the doors ready to open. For now, the knowledge rested quietly in my chest, burning steady, a flame no one else could see. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind rattle the windows, I already knew what the next day would bring: the sound of hammers, the scrape of paintbrushes, the first steps toward breathing life back into Seabourn Haven. The first morning of renovations, I stood on the steps of Seabourn Haven with my hair pinned back and a clipboard in my hand. The crew Victor had recommended pulled up in a battered truck, men half my age and twice my height. They stepped out with tool belts, jangling eyes sweeping over the peeling paint, the sagging shutters, and finally landing on me. One of them, a broad man with a baseball cap, pulled low, muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Whose grandma is running this show?" Laughter followed quick and sharp. I felt the sting of it, but didn't flinch. I had heard variations of that tone for years, dismissal disguised as humor. I let the silence settle until they shifted uncomfortably, then tapped the clipboard. "The dining hall comes first." We stripped the floor sand. It clean, new varnish, new light fixtures. "We'll patch the walls and restore the fireplace before anything else." The foreman raised a brow. Most folks would start with the roof or the guest rooms. I met his gaze steadily. "The roof has another season left. The dining hall is the heart. When that shines, the rest will follow." There was a pause, then a shrug, and the men got to work. By midday, the hall echoed with the sound of hammers, the whine of saws, the scrape of old nails being pulled from beams. I walked the floor, pointing out details, reminding them where outlets needed rewiring, where the wood was soft and had to be replaced. At first, they seemed surprised by my precision, but soon they began to nod, jotting down notes. Respect, I knew, was earned in small measures, and I was patient enough to collect them one by one. Dust filled the air, but as it settled on my shoulders, I felt alive. I remembered the Vermont lodge, the long days Daniel and I had spent polishing wood until it gleamed, coaxing life out of spaces others had dismissed. That memory guided my steps, steadying me as I watched this hall transform. In the evenings after the crew left, I would linger alone. The boards creaked beneath my feet as I stood in the half-finished hall, picturing it as it would be. Tables set end to end, polished oak, glinting in the light chairs filled with voices and laughter. No folding seats tucked into kitchens, no excuses about space. A place where every person had a place where no child would feel unwanted. The workers began to see me differently. By the second week, the man in the cap asked for my opinion before moving a beam. By the third, they called me boss without irony. I didn't need their approval, but it steadied me nonetheless. We patched the walls, brushed away years of neglect, and by the time the new lights flickered on, the hall glowed faintly as though it too had been waiting for someone to believe in it again. I stood beneath those lights with sawdust still clinging to my shoes, feeling something rise in me that had been buried under years of humiliation. The dining hall was not finished, but it was breathing again, and so was I. This was no longer ruin. It was possibility-wide and waiting, stretching out like the sea beyond the windows. And as the last worker left one evening, their tools clattering into the truck, I locked the door behind them and turned back toward the hall, already planning the next step, the rooms where children would sleep, the balconies, where families would lean into the salt air, the life that would soon fill these walls. When the last nail was hammered and the smell of varnish faded into the salty air, I decided it was time to test the dream. Not a grand unveiling, not yet, just a soft opening with people I trusted to see the rough edges and celebrate the effort. I called my cousin Ruth first, the one who always slipped me an encouraging word when Clara's barbs cut too deep. She agreed instantly, her voice lifting, as though she had been waiting for me to ask. Then I called my old friend Lillian, who had stood beside me through funerals and lean years, never once making me feel small. A few others followed, kind faces, who had never measured my worth against Clara's scale. When they arrived, their cars crunching down the newly graveled drive, I stood on the porch with Elias and Nora at my side. The garden was still young, only half planted, but the flowers that had taken root leaned toward the sun, and the fresh paint on the shutters gleamed in the light. Inside the dining hall shone with polished floors and new tables lined end to end. I had bought sturdy wooden chairs, each one matching each one with a place. No folding seats tucked away. No one would ever be told there wasn't room. That first night, the hall filled with voices. Ruth's laughter rang out as she poured wine. Lillian hummed as she laid dishes across the table. Elias and Nora darted between rooms, showing our guests the sweets they had helped me dust and prepare. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes bright. When Elias ran back to me, he whispered, "Grandma, this feels like home." Those words carried more weight than any appraisal or review ever could. They washed over me, clearing away the residue of Clara's disdain, proving that the years of silence had not broken us entirely. Nora, quieter but always perceptive, added, "It feels like we belong here." She glanced up at me with a look too old for her 12 years, and my heart ached and healed all at once. We spent the evening around the long table candles, flickering plates passing from hand to hand. The sound of waves drifted through the open windows, mixing with the chorus of laughter and clinking glasses. I leaned back, watching the scene unfold, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like an afterthought. I felt like the center of something alive. Later, when the children tumbled into bed and the adults sat with coffee, Ruth reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've given us more than a place to stay, Marjorie. You've given us a reminder that family isn't about who claims the head of the table. It's about who makes room for everyone else." Her words settled into me, like the finishing stitch on a garment I had been piecing together in secret. This was not just a building restored. It was a promise kept to myself and to the children who had asked year after year why we were never invited. When the last guest retreated to their rooms and the hall grew quiet, I lingered alone. The chairs were empty now, but I could still hear echoes of laughter in the beams, still feel the warmth of belonging stitched into the air. I ran my hand along the polished surface of the table, solid and smooth, and knew the house was no longer just walls and windows. It was ours. I blew out the candles, their smoke curling upward, and turned toward the door. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a place with a new life, and with it, whispers would begin to travel beyond these walls, whispers that might soon reach Clara's ears. News travels strangely in small towns, carried not by headlines, but by murmurs over grocery counters and whispers in church pews. It was Ruth who told me first, her lips curving with quiet amusement. "Your daughter was at the market yesterday," she said. "Someone mentioned a woman fixing up a beachfront resort." Clara laughed, said she couldn't imagine who would trust a retiree with something so ambitious. I didn't ask for more. I didn't need to. I could hear Clara's voice in my mind, that polished tone she used when she wanted her words to cut without looking cruel. Who would trust someone that old with business, she must have said, tossing her hair, earning the chuckles of her companions? What she didn't know, and what made Ruth's eyes gleam as she told me, was that the retiree in question was me. My own daughter dismissing the very work that was giving me back my breath, mocking the hands that had once held her when she was small. The irony was sharp enough to taste. At first, the knowledge stung. There was a part of me still raw from years of her judgment that wanted to march into that store plant myself in front of her and announce, "It's mine. I bought it. I'm building it." But I didn't. The truth was sweeter hidden for now, like wine deepening in a cellar. Some things gain strength in silence. Instead, I poured my energy back into the resort. Word was spreading quickly beyond my little circle of friends and cousins. Guests who had stayed during the soft opening were already speaking of it to neighbors, posting photos of the polished dining hall and the gardens we had coaxed back to life. Strangers began calling, curious about reservations. Each time the phone rang, my chest lifted. Meanwhile, Clara kept posting her summer traditions online photos of the beach house filled with toys and towels, her children holding ice cream cones, Mike grilling on the deck. She basked in the glow of her curated life, secure in the assumption that nothing around her could shift. She did not notice the whispers beginning to ripple around her edges, did not suspect the tide changing just beyond her sight. I knew it was only a matter of time before she heard the truth. Perhaps she would discover it at church when someone congratulated her on my venture, or at a family gathering when a cousin slipped and mentioned their stay at Seabourn Haven. However it came, the revelation would strike with the force of a storm. But for now, she laughed at the shadow of a rumor, blind to the fact that it was already standing in her doorway. And I let her laugh because every dismissive word only made the moment of truth more powerful when it finally arrived. One evening, after the workers had gone and the sun dipped low, I walked the length of the dining hall alone. The chairs were lined neatly against the tables. The floor gleamed with polish, and the windows were open to the sound of waves. I pictured Clara's smirk, the tilt of her head, when she spoke of me as if I were a burden, and I felt no anger, then only a calm certainty. She thought she knew the story of who I was. Soon she would learn that the story had changed, that the woman she dismissed as fragile had built something enduring, something she could neither control nor diminish. I turned off the lights one by one, letting the hall fall into twilight. The air smelled of fresh wood and sea salt, and as I locked the door, I knew the time was drawing near to open it fully, not just to friends, but to family. Invitations would need to be written, calls made, decisions taken about who would walk through these doors and who would remain outside. The decision came to me one quiet morning as I stood on the porch of Seabourn Haven. Coffee warming my hands while gulls wheeled overhead. The hall was finished, the rooms clean, the gardens sprouting new green. It was time to open the doors wider, not just to paying guests, but to the people who had stood by me when silence weighed heavy. Labor Day loomed on the calendar, a holiday Clara always claimed for her beach house gatherings. For 10 years that weekend had belonged to her, with her children running barefoot through the dunes while Elias and Nora watched from the sidelines. This year would be different. I pulled a stack of stationery from my desk and smoothed the first page. My handwriting had stiffened over the years, but as the pen moved, it loosened, carrying with it a kind of release. Dear Ruth and Martin, I wrote, I would be honored if you and your family would join us at Seabourn Haven this Labor Day weekend. Come rest by the sea-share meals at my table, and let's make new memories together. I wrote variations of the same to others. My sister Elaine, who always pressed my hand when Clara's barbs landed too sharp. My cousin David and his wife, who had struggled financially, yet never failed to ask after Elias and Nora. The Martinez family, who had treated me like kin, even when my own blood had not. Each letter was an invitation not only to a weekend, but to a new tradition, one built not on exclusion, but on welcome. When the letters were sealed, I picked up the phone. I wanted some to hear the words in my voice. Uncle Henry, I said I've opened a small resort near the coast. Would you and Aunt Marla like to come stay with us for Labor Day? No expense to you, just family food and the ocean. His pause was brief, followed by warmth. Marjorie, we wouldn't miss it. One by one, the responses came back. Voices bright with surprise, with gratitude, with something that felt like relief. Not one asked if Clara would be there. Not one hesitated. Clara, of course, received no letter, no call. It wasn't an oversight. It was the point. She had chosen her exclusivity for a decade. I was choosing inclusion now, but not at the cost of repeating her cruelty. The symbolism was sharp and deliberate. Elias and Nora helped me plan. They sketched menus, circled activities in local brochures, argued about whether cousins would prefer fishing or kayaking. Their excitement spilled into every corner of the house. For once, they weren't bracing for disappointment. They were building something alongside me. At night, I sat at the long table in the dining hall, the same one I had insisted be restored first, and I imagined it filled the hum of conversation. Children's voices. Rising dishes passed from hand to hand. The vision steadied me, replacing the bitterness of birthdays past with anticipation of what could be. Still, a small voice in me wondered what whispers would follow. Would Clara hear before the weekend came? Of course she would. News like this finds its way through family branches quickly. She would see the choice I had made, and she would feel the exclusion she had inflicted. I didn't savor the thought with cruelty, but with clarity. I wasn't punishing her. I was simply drawing the line she had drawn for me and stepping to the other side with those willing to join. As the invitation spread outward, I felt the weight of years begin to shift. For the first time in a long time, Labor Day was not a date to dread. It was a promise, one sealed in ink and sealed again in silence, where Clara's name should have been. The letters were gone, the calls made. All that remained was to see who would walk through these doors and sit at my table when the weekend came. Labor Day weekend dawned with skies so clear they looked freshly washed. By mid-morning, the driveway at Seabourn Haven was lined with cars, and the sound of voices carried across the gardens like a hymn. Relatives spilled out with coolers bags, and children darting in every direction. The resort was alive, not with strangers, but with family who had chosen to be here. Elias and Nora ran ahead, greeting cousins they hadn't seen in years. Their laughter rose above the crash of waves, unburdened for once by questions of why they weren't invited. I stood on the porch, the sea breeze tugging at my sleeves, and felt the hum of life filling the spaces I had rebuilt. The dining hall polished, and waiting soon rang with the clatter of plates and the rumble of conversation. Ruth and Martin sat at one end, retelling old family stories, while Uncle Henry carved roast chicken at the other. Children balanced heaping plates, darting in and out to the porch. Every seat was filled, every chair sturdy and equal. No one left standing, no one tucked away. That evening, as dusk settled, we carried wood to the fire pit by the beach. Flames rose against the darkening sky, sparks lifting like fireflies. The children roasted marshmallows, their faces glowing orange in the light, while the adults leaned back in folding chairs, the kind chosen not assigned. We sang a few songs clapped to the rhythm of waves and crackling fire, and for a moment it felt like time itself had paused to honor us. I caught Nora's face in the glow, her eyes' wide mouth curved in a smile so unguarded it startled me. She leaned against my shoulder and whispered, "This is what it's supposed to feel like." My throat tightened, but I nodded. This was what I had wanted for them all along. The sound of belonging carried on the night air. The weekend moved like water, flowing smooth and full. Mornings were filled with beachcombing afternoons, with games, evenings with meals that stretched until lanterns were lit. Each moment, I felt the weight of the past 10 years lift a little more. Meanwhile, Clara posted her usual stream of photos online, her children with sand buckets. Mike at the grill, the family stretched across their deck chairs. She wrote captions about tradition and cherished summers. But her photos showed only her side of the story. Word travels fast, though especially in families where gossip runs quicker than tides. By the second day, one cousin who had stayed with me let slip a photo of Seabourn Haven, the glowing dining hall, the bonfire on the sand, cousins arm in arm. It spread quietly, then faster, until I knew it must have reached Clara's feed. I imagined her scrolling, seeing the faces she expected at her table gathered at mine instead. I imagined the sting of realizing that while her beach house bustled, another tradition had been born just 2 hours down the coast, and she hadn't even been invited. But I didn't dwell on it long. The weekend belonged to us, to those who had accepted the invitation without hesitation. I poured wine past bread and let the hum of voices settle deep into my bones. On the final night, when the guests drifted off to their rooms and the fire died low, I walked the length of the dining hall alone. The chairs stood pushed in crumbs, scattered candle wax hardened in drips. It was messy, imperfect, alive. My footsteps echoed as I moved each creak of the floorboard, a reminder that this place was mine and that I had filled it with life. The phone on the counter buzzed, then its screen lighting with Clara's name. I stared at it, knowing without lifting it that she had heard that the sting of exclusion had finally landed on her side. The phone buzzed again, insistent, demanding an answer. I let it ring the sound carrying into the night and turned back toward the empty tables. The phone buzzed again the next morning, and this time I answered. Clara's voice burst through before I could even say hello, sharp and indignant. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded. "I had to hear from cousins that you bought some rundown hotel and turned it into whatever this is. A family gathering. Without us. Without me?" I listened in silence, letting her words rush like a tide. She mistook my quiet for hesitation and pressed harder. "Mom, do you know how humiliating it is to see pictures of our family together at your place while we're sitting here wondering why we weren't included? You deliberately left us out." Her accusation hung heavy, but I felt no guilt. I drew in a slow breath. "Clara," I said evenly, "do you remember the last 10 summers at your beach house? The times you called me in March with the same excuse. No room for me. No room for Elias and Nora." "That's different," she snapped. "You know how small the cottage is. We couldn't possibly fit everyone." "You understood that." My grip tightened on the phone. "Yes, I understood. And now I'll ask you to understand. Just like your house mine's out of room." For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then her voice returned, thinner, trembling with outrage. "That's not fair. You're punishing me. You're punishing my children. I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I invited the people who have made space for me all these years. You chose who mattered at your table. I've simply chosen who matters at mine." Her breath hitched audibly. I pictured her standing in her kitchen phone, pressed tight to her ear, struggling to find the words that once came so easily when she was dismissing me. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she hissed, finally. "Do you know what people are saying? They think you're petty vindictive. They think you're trying to divide the family." "They can think what they want," I replied. "The ones who know the truth were here this weekend. They saw who was included, and they saw why. They don't need explanations." In the background, I heard muffled voices, Mike perhaps, or one of her children asking what was wrong. Clara must have stepped into another room because her voice dropped low, almost pleading now. "Mom, please. We're family. You can't just cut us out." Her words might once have pierced me, but now they rang hollow. "Family," I said softly, "is more than a word you pull out when it suits you. For 10 years, you decided my branch of this family didn't fit. You told my grandchildren there was no room. Now I've shown them a place where there will always be space. That's all." Another long silence followed, broken only by her unsteady breathing. When she spoke again, the sharpness had faded, replaced by something unsteady. "So that's it. You're really shutting us out." I closed my eyes, remembering the folding chair in her kitchen, the humiliation of that birthday night. "No, Clara. I'm not shutting you out. I'm simply refusing to beg for scraps at your table. If you want a place here, you'll have to learn what it means to knock first." I ended the call before she could reply, my hand steady as I set the phone down. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different now, stronger. cleaner, like a wall rebuilt after years of erosion. Later that afternoon, Ruth came by to return a serving dish she had borrowed. She lingered at the porch rail, eyes cautious. "Clara's upset," she said gently. "But Marjorie, most of us, we understand. We've seen how she treated you. We're with you in this." Her words were a balm, quiet, but firm. For once, the whispers were not in Clara's favor, and as I stood watching Ruth drive away, I knew the cracks in Clara's throne of favoritism had begun to widen, whether she admitted it or not. It didn't take long for Clara to mount her campaign. Within days of our phone call, whispers circled back to me. She was telling anyone who would listen that I had become vindictive in my old age, that I was tearing the family apart out of spite. She framed herself as the wounded daughter, painted me as a bitter woman seeking revenge. I might have worried once, but this time the ground felt steadier beneath me. Because for every cousin who heard Clara's story, there was another who remembered the birthdays where she'd dismissed me, the summers where my grandchildren were left out, the sharp words she had spoken as if I were invisible. At the grocery store, Lillian leaned over her cart to murmur, "Clara stopped me yesterday, said you were shutting her out. I told her she's been shutting you out for years." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't like that. I thanked her not because I needed her defense, but because it warmed me to know the truth was finally being spoken aloud by someone other than me. The silence that had once protected Clara was cracking. Uncle Silas called next, his gravelly voice full of conviction. "Marjorie, I spoke to Clara. She claims you're causing a rift. I told her plain she created this division, not you. You can't exclude your own mother for 10 years and then cry foul when the tide turns." I closed my eyes, relief spreading like sunlight across my chest. Silas had always been blunt, a man who valued fairness above appearances. If he had spoken to Clara that way, others would follow. Word spread further. Ruth recounted how at a church gathering, Clara had tried to gather sympathy. "She said you were cruel," Marjorie Ruth explained, but half the room just stared at her. Finally, Carol spoke up, said she'd heard Clara make those comments about your work, how she'd cut you down in front of everyone. Clara's face went red. I pictured it clearly. Clara, so accustomed to controlling the narrative, suddenly cornered by her own history. The thought didn't bring me triumph so much as a deep, weary sense of balance finally restoring itself. Elias and Nora noticed too. At dinner one night, Elias said, "Grandma Dorian messaged me online. He said his mom keeps complaining about you, but he doesn't get why. He said he thinks you're amazing for doing all this." His cheeks flushed with pride as he spoke. Nora, quieter as always, added, "It's like people are finally seeing what we saw all along." Her words landed softly but firmly, reminding me why I had chosen this path. Clara didn't stop, of course. She doubled down, calling relatives one by one, trying to sway them with appeals to loyalty. But the more she spoke, the thinner her arguments sounded. The family had grown tired of her monopoly on affection, her casual cruelty. They were ready for something different, something kinder. By the end of the month, I felt the shift fully. When invitations for Thanksgiving began circulating, more than one cousin bypassed Clara's beach house entirely and asked if I would host again. The question alone told me everything the throne Clara had built on favoritism was crumbling, not because I had struck it, but because the crowd had finally walked away. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, letters spread out before me, each confirming plans to return to Seabourn Haven for the holiday. The house hummed with possibility, alive with voices not yet arrived. I felt no urge to call Clara, no desire to twist the knife. The truth was already speaking for itself. The fault lines had widened, and no matter how she tried to plaster over them, the cracks were there for all to see. And as autumn leaves began to scatter across the dunes, I turned my attention to preparing for Thanksgiving at Seabourn Haven, knowing the choice of where people gathered would tell the story more clearly than any argument ever could. The envelope came in mid-November, its thick paper and neat handwriting familiar. Clara's invitation to Thanksgiving was as polished as ever, gilded at the edges, as though formality could disguise the strain beneath. Family dinner at the cottage 4 o'clock, it read, signed with her usual flourish. I held it for a long moment, weighing it in my hands. 10 years ago, I would have tucked it carefully on the mantel, eager to show that I had been included. Now, I slipped it back into its envelope and set it in the drawer, knowing I had already chosen otherwise. My own invitations had gone out a week earlier. Simple notes on cream stationery, nothing fancy, but heartfelt. Thanksgiving supper at Seabourn Haven, I'd written. There will be room for everyone. The words mattered more than the paper. They carried a promise that no one would be turned away or placed on the margins. As the holiday neared, replies poured in. Ruth and Martin wrote that they couldn't wait. Uncle Silas confirmed he and his wife would be driving down. The Martinez family sent a note with a drawing from their youngest child, a turkey with feathers in every color. Elias and Nora pinned it to the fridge, proud that children outside our home saw this place as theirs too. On Thanksgiving Day, the resort glowed. The dining hall smelled of roasted turkey, and sage stuffing pies lined the sideboard, and the tables stretched long enough to seat every guest comfortably. Laughter echoed before the first dish was even served. Elias and Nora dashed about with cousins arranging name cards they had decorated themselves. When we sat to eat, I paused to look down the table. Every seat filled, faces lit by candlelight, the hum of voices mingling with the sound of waves beyond the windows. It was more than a meal, it was a declaration. We were here together by choice. Later, as coffee was poured and children slipped outside to chase each other through the gardens, Ruth leaned close and whispered. Clara's table was half empty this year. She asked, and people told her they'd already committed here. She didn't take it well. I nodded, though no part of me rejoiced in her emptiness. What I felt instead was a quiet settling, a balancing of scales long tilted in her favor. It wasn't about winning. It was about proving that belonging can't be commanded. It must be offered freely. As dusk fell, we moved to the porch with blankets and mugs of cider. The younger ones lit sparklers, their light weaving through the dark like fireflies. I watched Elias twirl his sparkler high, Nora's laughter ringing close behind, and I thought of all the Thanksgivings they had spent in shadow, asked to accept less than their worth. Those days were done. Inside, the candles burned low, their wax pooling in soft rivers down the holders. I glanced at the empty envelope still tucked away in my drawer, unopened, beyond its first glance. Clara's handwriting had carried authority once, but now it lay forgotten, eclipsed by the warmth of this table. By the time the last guest departed, hugging me tight at the door, the hall was quiet, but still humming with the memory of voices. I gathered the dishes slowly, unwilling to disturb the peace that lingered. And as I blew out the final candle, I thought of Christmas around the corner, wondering how Clara would try to reclaim ground she no longer held. The first snowfall dusted the dunes on Christmas Eve, softening their edges, making the world look hushed and new. I was in the kitchen pulling cinnamon rolls from the oven for Elias and Nora when the phone rang. Clara's name lit the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it pass into silence as I had before. But something in me wanted to hear her voice to measure what if anything had changed. I answered. "Mom," she began, her tone practiced, almost brittle. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if you felt excluded all those years." The words were careful, clipped, and hollow. "If you felt." A phrase meant to place the weight back on me, to soften her responsibility into something subjective. My hand tightened on the phone. "Clara," I said slowly, "that's not an apology. That's an excuse wrapped in lace. You didn't exclude me because of how I felt. You excluded me because of how you acted." She bristled audibly. "Why do you always have to make everything so dramatic? I'm trying to make peace here, but you're impossible." I set the tray of rolls on the counter and leaned against the wall. "Peace without respect isn't peace, it's surrender. And I won't surrender anymore." On the other end, I heard her sigh, sharp and impatient. "So what do you want from me?" "A performance you want me to get down on my knees and beg I want the truth," I replied. "I want you to acknowledge that you made choices that hurt me and my grandchildren, that you pushed us aside for a decade, and that you enjoyed the power of doing it. Respect first, Clara. Then forgiveness can follow. Not before." Silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the faint sound of her children in the background, laughing, tearing open paper, the clatter of a holiday untouched by our fracture. Finally, her voice returned softer, but no steadier. "I don't know if I can do that." "Then we have nothing more to discuss," I said. "Not until you can." Her sharp inhale told me she wasn't used to the line being drawn on my side. For years I had bent, swallowed, and nodded. Not now. The line was firm, carved into stone by too many birthdays, missed too many summers lost. She muttered something I couldn't catch, then hung up. I set the phone down gently, the silence in my kitchen deeper now, but not empty. Elias peeked around the corner, nose twitching at the smell of cinnamon. "Everything okay, Grandma?" I smiled faintly and slid a roll onto his plate. Everything's finally in its place. We ate warm bread while snow fell beyond the window, the house glowing with quiet certainty. The olive branch Clara had offered was frozen brittle, snapping in my hands before it could take root. But I felt no regret. Some branches are better left broken than forced back onto the tree. And as the children drifted into laughter and wrapping paper, I turned my thoughts to the new year, knowing fresh battles and choices would come with it. The first week of January brought Clara's children to Seabourn Haven. Not by Clara's design, she hadn't spoken to me since Christmas, but through Elias and Nora, who invited their cousins for a weekend of games and beachcombing. I agreed. Children should not bear the brunt of adult battles. They arrived with backpacks and bright eyes tumbling out of the car like a wave of energy. For 2 days, they played freely, building forts in the dunes, chasing each other across the wide porch, laughing without the undercurrent of tension that always seemed to hover at Clara's house. On the final evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the water in streaks of gold, Clara's eldest, Julian, lingered by my side. 14, now taller than I remembered, but his face carried the same openness I had once seen in Clara before she learned how to sharpen her smiles. "Grandma," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We like it here better." I turned toward him, uncertain I'd heard. "Better than what, sweetheart?" "Better than Mom's house," he replied, words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Because here, everyone matters. Nobody gets pushed aside." The simplicity of it struck me harder than any accusation Clara had ever thrown. From the mouths of children, truth has a way of cutting past defenses. I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying both him and myself. "I'm glad you feel welcome here," I said softly. That's how it should be. But Clara must have seen it in their faces when she came to collect them the next morning. Her smile was too bright, her grip on the steering wheel too tight. The children chattered about bonfires, about Nora's drawings, about the dining hall games. Julian leaned forward in the passenger seat, telling her how different it felt. I watched the realization flicker across her face that her children were slipping not from her embrace but from her narrative. They had glimpsed another way of belonging, one not rooted in hierarchy but in shared space. And once a child sees fairness, it is hard to unsee the lack of it elsewhere. Her eyes darted to mine as she pulled away a flash of panic buried beneath her polished expression. But I did not move, did not chase after her, did not offer comfort. Some lessons cannot be softened. They must be faced raw. I stood on the porch long after the car disappeared down the road, the salt air cold against my skin, my heart steady. The line had been drawn, and now even her own children were beginning to see it. Inside, Elias and Nora were already setting the table for lunch, their laughter spilling into the hall. The sound grounded me. My table was full, my walls strong, my purpose clear. And somewhere, Clara's certainty had begun to crack. My 71st birthday arrived with a clear sky and the promise of celebration. Seabourn Haven was alive from dawn. Elias and Nora racing through the halls, cousins arranging flowers, Ruth bustling in the kitchen with pies. By evening, the dining hall glowed with candles, every seat filled. I took my place at the head of the long table, not because it was the place of power, but because it was the place where I could see every face. The chatter swelled, children darted between chairs, and the scent of roasted lamb and baked bread rose warm into the rafters. In the center of the table sat a single brass key. Polished heavy, it caught the candlelight and gleamed like a small sun. The children noticed it first, whispering and pointing, their curiosity bubbling. When the plates were cleared and cake brought forward, I reached for the key and held it up. The room quieted, eyes turning toward me. "This," I said, my voice carrying steady through the hall, "is not just a key to a door. It is a reminder. For 10 years we were told there wasn't room for all of us, that some belonged and some did not. But here there is always room for those who come with respect." I looked at my grandchildren, at Elias and Nora, sitting tall with pride, and at Clara's children, their eyes wide, listening. "This door," I continued, "opens only for those who knock with respect. It will never open for entitlement. It will never open for cruelty. Remember that always." Julian, Clara's eldest, leaned forward, his face solemn. "We understand, Grandma," he said softly. His siblings nodded, the weight of the words sinking into them, like stone into water. Applause rippled through the hall, not loud, but warm, affirming. I placed the key back on the table where it shone quietly amid the plates and candles. Later we moved outside to the beach. A fire crackled, warming the cool night air. Someone lit the first firework, and it streaked upward before bursting into sparks over the sea. The children squealed, their laughter echoing across the waves, and the adults clapped voices mingling with the crackle of flame and the hiss of the tide. I stood back, watching it, all the tables inside still glowing with candlelight, the sky alight with color. The people who had chosen to be here because they believed in what this place represented. The brass key was safe in my pocket, now heavy against my palm. its meaning etched deeper than any metal could hold. Fireworks bloomed one after another, scattering gold and red across the dark, while laughter rose from every corner of the resort. And I knew with the certainty of the tide that I had built something stronger than a house or a tradition. I had built a table where respect was the only seat that mattered. When respect finally knocks, do you open the door or guard it forever? Outline. Setting: Clara's Beach House, Outer Banks, North Carolina.